Living by faith. Without land to cultivate or resources of their own, the Levites had to depend entirely on God for their daily needs. They had no fields to plant, no vineyards to harvest, and no inheritance to fall back on for security. Instead, their sustenance came from what God provided through the tithes and offerings of the other tribes. This wasn't just a logistical arrangement, it was a profound act of faith. Every day, the Levites were reminded that their well-being rested not on visible resources, but on the invisible faithfulness of God. They had to trust that He would provide for them through the obedience and generosity of His people, and He did, just as He promised. Their example speaks powerfully to us today. In a world that values tangible security, like savings, possessions, and career stability, it can be challenging to embrace a life of trust. Yet, true faith isn't rooted in what we can see or control. It's about having confidence in the character and promises of God, even when the outcome isn't immediately clear. This story challenges us. When we face uncertainty, whether in our finances, relationships, or future, do we lean on visible securities, or do we trust God to provide? Trusting God doesn't mean ignoring practical responsibilities, but it does mean releasing the fear of lack and embracing the peace that comes from relying on His provision. The Levites remind us that faith is more than belief. It's an active choice to depend on God daily, knowing that His faithfulness never fails. When we live this way, we discover that even without the visible safety nets, God's provision is abundant and sufficient for every need. A life of service. The Levites lived a life wholly dedicated to serving others and standing in the sacred space between God and His people. Their role was not about personal advancement or accumulating material wealth. It was a divine calling to be instruments of God's work on earth. Day by day, they carried out priestly duties, offering sacrifices, maintaining the tabernacle, teaching God's laws, and leading the people in worship. These tasks were not glamorous, and they often went unnoticed by many. Yet, their work was essential to the spiritual life of the entire nation of Israel. Through their service, the Levites became a bridge, mediating God's presence and blessings to His people and bringing the people's offerings and prayers before God. This life of service was rooted in purpose, not profit. The Levites' inheritance wasn't material land or wealth, but the privilege of fulfilling a higher mission. Their focus was on the eternal, prioritizing spiritual significance over temporary gains. Their example challenges us today. What are we living for? Are we caught up in the pursuit of material success? Or are we dedicating ourselves to something greater, a purpose that goes beyond ourselves? True fulfillment doesn't come from accumulating possessions, but from living a life that impacts others and aligns with God's plans. The Levites remind us that service is not a lesser path. It is a divine calling that brings deep satisfaction and eternal value. When we prioritize serving others, whether in ministry, our communities, or even in our daily interactions, we reflect God's heart and find meaning that transcends the fleeting rewards of this world.